The imaginary number is defined to be I equals the square root of -1. We'll use this when dealing with concepts in the example below. I squared is I times I, so we have the square root of -1 times the square root of -1, which is -1. So I squared we can define to be -1. This comes up later when dealing with operations on I. Let's evaluate the square root of -64. We can rewrite this as the square root of 64 times -1. We can then break apart the radical. Square root of 64 times the square root of -1. 64 is a perfect square, so we get the square root of 64 is 8, and then the square root of -1 is defined to be I. In the next example, we can rewrite this as the square root of 8 times -1. Then we can break apart the radical. Square root of 8 times the square root of -1. Notice this time 8 is not a perfect square. That's okay. Sometimes we can still simplify numbers that are not perfect squares, like 8. So I'm going to do that off to the side. Square root of 8 we can write as 4 times 2. We want to use 4 because 4 is a perfect square that is a factor of 8. We can then rewrite this as the square root of 4, square root of 2, which is 2, square root of 2. Going back to our square root of 8, we get 2 square roots of 2. And then remember the square root of -1 is I. A complex number is any number that can be written in the form a plus bi, where a and b are real numbers. We're going to call this standard form. We have the real part first and the imaginary part second. We typically want to do that whenever we're dealing with complex numbers. We want to put it in standard form. In the example below, let's see if the given are complex numbers. Part A, -1 plus 2i. This is a complex number. A, the real part, is -1, and B, the imaginary part, is 2. In example B, again, this is a complex number. A is simply pi, and B is the square root of 2. And finally, in C, it may not look like it at first, but it is a complex number. The real part is 0, and the imaginary part is -12. This one is considered to be purely imaginary because A is 0. The only part you see is the imaginary part. Let's simplify this expression and write it as a complex number. The real part is good. We need to rewrite the square root of -125. We can start by writing this as the square root of 125 times the square root of -1. Now 125 is not a perfect square, but it does contain a factor that is a perfect square. So that square root can be simplified. Let's start doing that off to the side. The square root of 125 can be written as 25 times 5. And the reason we want to use 25 is it is a perfect square. That is a factor of 125. So we can rewrite this as square root 25 square root 5, which is then 5 square root 5. Going back to our example, we now have -6 plus 5 square root 5, and then the square root of -1 is I. We now have the simplified complex number.